Welcome to episode 67 of the FoodGrads Podcast, the podcast where we explore careers in the food, beverage, and agricultural industries. I'm your host, Veronica, a PhD candidate in molecular science and career partner with FoodGrads. This week on the podcast, I interviewed Bryan Le, food scientist, food industry consultant, and author of the book 150 Food Science Questions Answered. Bryan earned his PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he studied the biological effects of savory flavors from plant-based sources. In this episode, Bryan shared with me what exactly a food science consultant does and how he began his practice while completing his PhD. We talked shop about things that Bryan finds challenging about being a consultant, what he enjoys, and how the schedule of being a consultant works well for him. Bryan explained how he is an effective food science consultant, despite not being an expert in all topics. Additionally, we talked about our experiences, in my case, being a PhD, in his completing his PhD, and what are the challenges that are faced throughout that journey. I also asked Bryan about how he approaches designing experimental designs and his opinions on the future of food. Bryan is so fun, and you can tell that he just loves what he's doing. I love Bryan's approach to things, and his honesty is quite refreshing. So I really enjoyed that aspect of the podcast. This episode of the podcast is powered by Careers Now. Careers Now is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry for exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. So, that's it for this introduction. Let's get on with the show. So, thank you so much, Bryan, for taking the time to come on the show. You've been on my radar for a long time, even before I've been doing this podcast. And I know you've been everywhere. You're on Reddit. I don't know, you just pop up everywhere. But even with your book, for example, with your 150 questions about food science, like you've been doing a lot, and I'm so happy you were able to take the time to come on the show. So thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I love to be able to speak about food science in any way or capacity.
Food science is such a fun topic, and I'm really curious about your journey and like how you ended up in food science particularly. I know that you have a chemistry degree, so I can kind of vibe with you on that. But before
hmm
we start to go into that journey, I just want to start by going about food science consultancy and talking about what you're doing. So let's start by first talking about what you currently do, and then maybe we'll walk our way through to how you got there.
Sounds good. Yeah. I graduated with my PhD in food science about 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I guess, at this point. And nowadays, I'm basically just this sort of freelance pirate, like mercenary for hire. So I just do food science for anyone, any company that's interested in acquiring my skill set, so to speak. But basically, maybe someone has a project, maybe they're interested in formulating a product, or maybe they're further along and they're having some issues with production. Sometimes it's like they want to do research, do like a review of, the current technologies in food. And I'm pretty much all over the place. Like I do any of it. If someone's gonna come to me, I'm most likely gonna do it at this stage of my career, just because one, I don't know what I'm really good at, so I might as well try. And then two, everything's really interesting. I really like to learn. So, the more novel it is, the more I'm willing to take a risk and give it a shot. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And starting there, like the word food science it's pretty broad. I mean, we
hmm
talk about that. So it can mean anything to some people from food safety to food processing and such. So do you cover the whole spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, if I can, if I can find the textbook for it, and or if I need to find the papers for it, I'll do that. But I'll basically, I'm just 2 steps ahead of my client. That's really what the way I frame it. And if I can find information faster than them, I've at least solved that problem for them. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So even if I'm not an expert, I don't tout myself as an expert in any particular thing. Sometimes I hang around plant-based stuff. Sometimes I hang around beverages just because those are the things that people contact me for. And anything involving flavors, I'm down for. But yeah, I mean, if someone has a problem with production, I'll go and bust open a food processing engineering textbook and see if I can find that issue. Or they're trying to formulate an ice cream. I don't know very much about ice cream, but I do know how to find that information. So for me, and I'm pretty upfront about that. I'm not telling people, oh, I'm an expert at X, Y, and Z. I'm really just saying like, yeah, sure, I'll help. And that's it. That's about as deep as people go in terms of my background. I think they take my word for it that I did in fact graduate with a PhD.
That's that.
No one's like asking for my dissertation, right? Like that's never happened in my life.
Oh, it's
So
no small feat doing that. And something I've learned is doing the PhD is you learn how to learn on your own. It's
yeah.
very, you didn't come into this with your dissertation being, I mean, probably with you as well. Like you might have had a general base chemistry degree, but actually
Hmm.
going to that being super specific, like food science requires, yeah, PhD teaches you how to learn.
Yeah, exactly. And I just hope that in any format I'm providing some kind of value. So far, so good.
Well, I can imagine for a lot of your clients as well, like that in itself can be its own value, because saving them time looking for it, if you have those transferable
Mhm,
skills that can look for something like that, would you, just to help the audience have a better grasp at something, would you be able to provide
mhm.
a general idea of maybe a project that you've worked on and like how you
Sure.
gone in as a consultant on that?
Sure. So let's say there's a food startup, they want to make like a plant-based meat of some sort. They're interested in, the flavor design for some kind of meat, flavor and texture and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not an expert at any of those particular things, but maybe their R&D department, they don't have the time to really delve into like the really nitty gritties. They have a particular issue. Maybe there's an off flavor. Maybe they're running into issues with the shelf life or something along those lines. But I will go in and I will go through the research literature and I'll find like the one or two papers that has to do with that particular issue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll summarize that. And I think that's really important because it's not that the person I'm interacting with doesn't know that stuff. Like, nine times out of ten, if it's a well-funded startup, that person probably has a PhD as well. Um, but really what I'm doing is I'm able to just gather the information very quickly and offer it in a way that's very succinct. So I communicate it. Um, and they can just take that and run with it. And something that might have taken them maybe 4 or 5 hours, I probably already have seen it before, and so it takes me like 30 minutes. And that's kind of the value that I provide is like I have a general sense of certain areas of research and where to look for things. I don't necessarily know the details, but I'll pull them up and deliver them in a very you know compact manner, so to speak.
Oh, okay. See, but that makes a lot of sense because one of the things I'll draw from being in PhD, and I can imagine it's very similar to working in processing, is that probably in processing your time's also very fragmented. So you have to
Hmm.
go off and do this at like 1 p.m. and you have to do something at 11.
Hmm.
And on paper, it doesn't seem like it's something that would really, you still have your 2 hour block of time, for example, but in the day to day, it actually does really affect, how your brain thinks. You might be tired to go into, because that's
Hmm.
another thing, like actually being
Yeah,
able to identify this is a key thing that I need to know. Like, they're overwhelmed people.
exactly. They have a million and one things that they need to do. And so like, for a long time I used to think, consulting was about being that expert, but as I got more into it, I realized that it's really about saving people time and saving people money, right? So I just happen to have this background in science and in chemistry and food science. I'm just trying to save people time and money, and that's a really good way for me to frame my work because otherwise again, I don't necessarily know everything, right? But I can at least help a person figure it out.
I really appreciate your openness in just sharing something like that because I'll be honest, I've for a long time have, and to be honest, even now, still think of consultants as being experts. Maybe it's
Hmm.
the PhD in me that like if you have this, like you're an expert in this exact, like you put your name to a consultant, you should be that expert. So, maybe I'm learning, but clearly with this conversation, it's going to change my mind.
I hope so. Yeah. Because I had the same perspective, right, for a long time. And I actually, when I first started out, that was one of my hangups was a lot of people were telling me like, "Oh, you don't have enough experience. You didn't do X, Y, and Z." I'm like, the research I did was like marginally related to what I do now. So it's like not even that it doesn't even provide me any real background. But ultimately, I think I was talking to professors, I was talking to friends and my family, and everyone was, it was almost like this resistance or this, they're trying to dissuade me to go down this route. But I think I was so desperate because I didn't have a job and I was just looking for work. And I just kind of happened to realize this sort of fundamental truth, which is that, hey, like, most people don't know, like everyone knows their particular thing, right? There's one particular thing, but everyone has a blind spot, right? And as long as you can help shine a light on that blind spot, again, if as long as I'm one or two steps ahead, I'm doing something. Yeah, and so that's it's taking me a while to get to that point, but yeah, it the rest is just sort of marketing, right?
That's true. Well, you've definitely I mean, the fact that you've been on my radar for a while being a consultant, like it really has, like you've been on my peripherals, like in the food science space. So I guess you're doing something good with the marketing.
I hope so.
Talking about that though, it sounds like you've had some, I'm not sure if I want to where I want to take this question because I could go in the positive direction, but maybe we'll do it as a
Mhm, mhm,
two-parter. But I think I want to
mhm.
start by talking about like what have you enjoyed about consulting? Like what has
Mm,
like
mm.
because you've been doing this now for a little bit. Like what has made you decide that you want to continue doing this rather than maybe going to try to find a job?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I had an internship during my PhD program, and that was, I mean, it's sad for me to say this because my wife gives me a lot of grief, mostly because she was kind of a pull herself by the bootstraps person, and she worked and she's worked all her life, even during school. And I'm very privileged to have only worked at a production facility once in a 3 month time period. And that period I appreciated because it let me experience the real world outside of the laboratory and academia. And it also taught me that that wasn't where I wanted to go, right? Like it was,
Hmm.
I was making cheese at a plant. I was really like supposed to be an assistant supervisor for all this stuff, but it was just, there were so many ways that the efficiency could be increased. And there were so many ways that I thought things didn't have to necessarily be done the way that they were doing it. But there was so much bureaucracy. And no one was really paying any attention to my recommendations because I'm just this intern.
Hmm.
Um, and from that, I was like, hold on a second. Like, I'm pretty sure there's value in what I'm saying. And I really wanted to test that out. And that's where like that desire to be curious and learn quite a bit kind of plays into this is that I don't sit still very well. And so I can't do things routinely. And I always tell my clients I'm a bad employee. Like, please don't hire me. Like if you want to hire someone that's able to do like a set task and do it well, that's not me. Like I'm a person that's always trying to figure out better ways to do things for whatever reason. And so I thought maybe that's one way for me to put myself out there and actually make a livelihood of my for myself. And it's worked out so far. And I think that's probably the number one thing I love about the consulting is that I was able to sort of test this hypothesis of, yeah, there's some value here. Like maybe it's not being recognized in the conventional or traditional routes of employment, but I know this can help save other people money. And then the second bit is that because I don't sit still very, very well, my schedule is always constantly fragmented. And that's just the nature of how I've worked all my life. School, that's like how I do things. And so
Hmm.
I don't do very well with a 9 to 5 schedule. I'm always trying to like great ideas come or terrible ideas come too, but all sorts of hours of the day. And when and where I work is pretty irrelevant to me. It's really just about capturing that moment where I have inspiration and I'm like, okay, this needs to be put down. And then that's sort of the rosy version of that. The
Hmm.
other end of it is that because I don't have fixed schedule, the income goes up and down, right? Like so I'm always hunting for the next project. I think in year 3 it's been a little easier. I've actually had a lot better success just letting people come to me, which I'm really grateful for because of the current inflation
Hmm.
situation and economics and that sort of thing. So I think my name is sort of all the weird quirky like off like single tweets and like Reddit posts, like they've all somehow like managed to become some something beneficial
If
to me.
you're yeah, if you're in the right place putting out like and the key is you're putting out good information, I think your name will transcend you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I'm surprised by the way that people find me in some of the most obscure things that I did because one day I was bored.
Yeah, boredom is what leads to scientists sometimes, a lot of the
Yep.
greatest discoveries, so yeah.
Oh
Um,
man.
in talking with that, now I'm thinking, like, how did you actually get your first client, though? Like,
Mm,
how was that experience? Because that is it's funny that I was talking with you because my friend, she's starting to do consultancy, and she's just, like, asking me
yeah.
questions, and I'm like, "I've never done this, why are you asking me?"
Well, hopefully I can provide, fill in that little gap.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one was really tough. Like I said, there's a lot of pushback, and I'm so grateful because my wife really, she was the one that really gave me the support that I needed. So I graduated in August 2020, shortly after sort of the lockdowns were starting to lift. We ended up having to move back with our parents. It was a bit, you're
Mm.
married and sort of early 30s. It's really disappointing to between us have 5 degrees. It's really that's not like the
It's
top
just
point
the
in my life.
reality, but
It is the reality, exactly. But I'm glad I did it because it gave me some time to. I basically had a 3 month runway before we decided to move out of our respective families' houses. But in those 3 months, I sat down and made a game plan to basically cold email anyone and everyone that I knew was a decision maker in the food industry, primarily startups, because I knew that from my previous experiences, just talking with people, I knew that, the thing with startups is you don't have a whole lot of access to talent. And that's just because you're a no name kind of thing. And so it's hard to hire someone. You don't want to spend, $100,000 plus per year on someone that you're not sure if you need. So that became kind of my little niche where I was like, you can hire me for like, 5-10 hours and I'll solve your problem. And it was kind of like my little delivery. But I spent a lot of time sending out a ton of emails. Most of them did not get responded to. But over time, I started seeing a pattern. I'd get some responses, and eventually it would be a no. But then I just kept tweaking my emails until I hit this weird sweet spot. And I discovered like this weird quirk about I guess founders in the startup space, which is they really love it when you talk about them, like like extraordinary levels of joy when they hear their name. So that's what I did was I did the subject line and I put like a paragraph or two in the email all about them. I was like 100% focused on that. I was like, congrats on like raising that money and like, wow, what a great thing you're doing for the world. If it was like environmental or yada, yada, yada. And that was the hook, right? Like that allowed them to, they would read that email and I knew they would because they would respond immediately after. And then, I put my little a couple liners about what I do, who I am. And that after like maybe 100 emails, I got one client. And that client hired me for 1 year. And it wasn't like for a full-time salary or anything like that. It was maybe like a recurring $1,000 a month. But that was what it that I'm so grateful for you guys. That allowed me to start my business. Otherwise I
Wow.
wouldn't have been able to do it.
Well, good for you. Wow, that's, I mean, for a first one, yes, not having a one up, like, at least you had some mental hope that, like, okay, they've seen the value in my skills to go for a full year
Hmm.
in this. So that would, I think, in itself is just a confidence boost.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think everyone was surprised when they heard that. I was like, yeah, it can be done. I can do this. And it was very helpful, definitely.
That's amazing. And coming out of your, we touched upon it earlier, PhD and that. And I just wanted to know, like, how do you think let's go to the nitty gritty more of like skills. How do you
Hmm.
think your PhD has helped you to be able to be well suited for your current role?
Yeah, I would say, gosh, I mean, it's largely just a matter of having that endurance. I realize that that's probably, if anything, I learned from the PhD was just being able to endure lots of failure and recognize that that wasn't the end of the day. Like you're gonna be okay. And when you're in it, it's really hard to see that perspective. But after I graduated, I looked back and I realized that you're just constantly barraged with failure, whether that's the experiment themselves, whether that's like submitting publications, even talking to your advisor, right? Or your social life is like in shambles. I'm barely like above water with my wife, right? Like so it's just you learn that like life kind of dishes you a lot of things in that experience. So that to me is like kind of number one skill set, if you can call it that. And that's helped me tremendously because, people say no so often, and I'm not like, sometimes it stings, but I'm not phased by the idea that it's really more of a numbers game, right? Eventually,
Mhm.
if I can assume 3% or 5% success, it's small, but that means like I just have to crank the numbers. And that's what the PhD felt like. It was experiment number 162. Like let's see what we can do here.
I'm not laughing at you. I'm laughing at the fact that I feel you so much right now. It's not like everything you're saying. I'm just like I had a conversation with someone like last week about the exact same thing, and they're like, it's
Mhm.
there's a light at the end of the tunnel. Because I asked them the same thing, and they said, I didn't really learn how to deal with the failures. You just get enough of them that you just kind of just push on. Like it's not,
Yep.
I don't have really good advice on how to get over it because yes, when you're on batch number 200, like you feel like there's something you're doing wrong. And
Right.
maybe there is stuff that you're doing wrong, but it's a learning thing and it's very you signed yourself up for normally 4 years to do a very niche thing that you might not know is even going to work. So it's
Yep.
yeah, I guess okay, I'll take that. I can look at this as a positive, as enduring as it is. I don't like it in the process, but clearly from you as well. There's a light at the end of the tunnel.
There's a light at the end of the tunnel. Yes. And it gets bleak. I admit. Like I definitely had many, many moments where I was like, I can't do this. I'm gonna give up. I'm gonna, throw in the towel. But I don't know. I don't know what what it is about. It's not, at some point, it's not even proving anything to yourself. It's because, like, what is there to prove, right? At the end of the day,
Mhm.
but it's just a barrage. I don't know how to explain it. You just keep hunkering through, and eventually you make it out. And I think a lot of life is like that, and especially this sort of game of doing business. Maybe not to the extreme of, all the nitty-gritties of you need to
Mhm.
know this particular theory and this particular like, reference and yada yada yada. But I think it's that this to your point, the second skill set is learning to experiment, right? And that's really more of a holistic thing. Like there's a lot of things you can experiment with when it comes to the consulting or even with your life. And I think learning to design a good experiment is critical because you don't want to waste your resources, right? You don't want to
Mhm.
sit there and go, well, I'm going to throw in, you know, $10,000 worth of chemicals and reagents and equipment at this thing and hope it works. No, you want the like what's the $100 experiment that you can do that will at least verify that this is worth doing. Then you can, move up and say, okay, now I'm going to scale up. I'm going to, conduct
Mhm.
these set of syntheses, yada yada yada, because I know like in theory this should work. But you know what I mean? You're constantly building up. So you're not just going all in. And I think that to me has been really important to learn is every time I thought it was a good idea to go all in was a terrible idea.
I've learned that too. Very that it has come very much to my realization that, you know, it's again easy to say on paper, I'm going to do this and then plow through it in the day, and then you're just left standing there going, that was a really bad idea.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And like, so I've taken that lesson and, I do a lot of micro experiments. I do like really off informal surveys and that sort of thing, just so I understand like, does it make sense what I'm doing? Does it make sense for me to be talking to these people? Like, is there real information here? Because you're not going to get that information online. I think that you do have to like experience these things because
Mhm.
everyone's so different, and the feedback you get from the world is so different because you have different ways of approaching things, different ways of thinking. So like you can read a blog and read a book and all that. And I used to love doing that. I used to, I'd sit for hours like reading about the next entrepreneurship, yada yada yada.
Mhm.
And it just never clicked. Like I loved reading about it and I really enjoyed it. But then when it came time to actually doing the consulting and doing the business, I was like left very, very empty with that kind of information. So, at the end of the day, like in the PhD program, you can read all the papers you want, but that doesn't translate to actual experience on the ground and getting the results that you need.
Mhm. Well, saying that you want to do like micro experiments, like what does that mean? Will you have a grand idea and then you'll look at it and say, I need to scale this back? Like how do you grade like or gauge, sorry, how do you gauge like this is a good quick experiment or if it's not? Because food is also very dynamic as well. There's a lot
Hmm.
of,
Hmm.
you can tell two people to cook an egg and you could have the same instructions and you get two different eggs. Like how do you validate what you're doing? It's quick and like a good idea to move forward, if that makes
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's yeah, that's a good question. It's again one of those things you have to learn over and over again. But I think the best barometer for a good experiment is can you do it in such a way that it doesn't take so much of your mental space. Like I think those grand ideas take a lot of energy in your head and they sort of suck a little bit of your thoughts. And when I notice myself doing that, I have to pick out like what's that one thing that if I could prove would not change everything. I think definitely a bad rabbit hole to go down. Like nothing like changes everything. Like you're still doing the same thing. Maybe you have a little more insight. But yeah, like what is the one thing I could do that will give me the one data point that will say if that will give me the next possible iteration. And it's hard to really describe that in detail, but I think, along the way it what it looks like is you email one person and then you see if that gives you the feedback that you need, if
Mhm.
that's the connection that you need, or it's something like let me write like this particular message or tweet or something, and then you just look at the numbers and the quantitative information that you get from that micro
Yeah.
experiment, so to speak. And then, like I said, I do some surveys. I use my Reddit a lot as sort of a breeding ground for new thoughts.
Mhm.
And I'll throw out like a survey, something I can pull together in like 10 minutes. And then I get that data, and that gives me a lot of information. it's about executing on that information as well. And then you have to kind of make this decision. I think it's really tough because how I live my life now with the consulting looks very different from what I did as a PhD student in the sense that like I don't actually work that much. So like my time is very valuable to me. Not that it wasn't before. It
I
was
get
very
it. I get
valuable
it.
to me. Yes. But
I
maybe
get
it wasn't valuable to other people. Now it's also valuable to other people. So because my time I covet it so much. I do this sort of informal calculation is like, what can I do something that's worth my time, and will that give me the information that I need to move forward? And it can mean a lot of different things. And sometimes you have to just go for it. Like if you feel really passionate about something, it's like a great opportunity. And that has happened a few times. I just go for it. Half and half, right?
Yeah.
What I want an inspection. Sometimes a complete waste of time. The other end of the spectrum, I'm like, wow, like I can't believe. For example, writing the book, that was like a crazy situation because it was right before. It was in the same year I defended my dissertation. So
Madman.
I don't. It
Madman.
was nuts. It was a lot of work. But I'm glad I did it. So
It sounds as what you're saying is just with doing experiments is doing the heart of what an experiment is supposed to be. Take one variable. You're supposed to look at one
hmm
thing at a time, not five things, even
hmm
though you get very passionate, like at least I do. You get passionate about doing
yeah,
it. Even the back in the head, you're like, no, don't do it. Just do one. Just do one. But that's
yes,
what it seems
yes,
like you're doing is being it sounds like you've come to the grasp of being more concise and clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that
yes,
is
yes,
really
yes.
clear to where to move forward with it.
Yes, exactly. But then you just keep finding those people that resonate with you. And eventually you have a real offering because you're clear. As long as you're clear with yourself about it, I think people pick up on that. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what real confidence is not, it's not like the necessarily the way you talk or how you talk or what you talk about, but it's kind of an internal thing where you're like, yeah, I know I'm valuable. I know that what I have to say is valuable, and then you let people take it or leave it.
Well, that's really good. I guess we could say advice. Like I'm not sure where I'm going to go with that word, but you know, um, I am going to shift the conversation because one of the reasons I also wanted to get you on is just I think you'd be a great person to just have an idea about like the future of the food industry. And I think that a lot of big changes are coming. Like I think
hmm
with like just technology, like I think a lot of our society in general is just going to be changing, but let's
hmm
obviously focus on the food industry for this podcast. But
Yeah.
I wanted to just talk to you about what do you see being some of the biggest changes that are upcoming in the food industry, particularly in food science?
Yeah. I mean, I think people talk a big game as far as AI and the marriage of AI with food science. That's and we've seen sort of like the pitfalls of going all in with certain things like Chat GPT. Like everyone talks about it, but I'm like, I don't know if my life has changed that much because of this invention,
Mhm.
so to speak. But I'm hoping that the foundation will be laid down in the next decade or two where we can connect the visceral subjective experience of food and flavor with something that can quantitatively analyze it with an algorithm. It doesn't have to be something that's artificially intelligent, but I think that to me is such a powerful possibility, but is so challenging in practice because how
Mhm.
do you tell a machine what people like? I mean, you
Yeah.
can use likes, you can use you know, you can use survey metrics, and I think that's a lot what sensory science is. It's like using numbers as sort of a proxy, but that doesn't get at the heart of what it is about food that we love. And that's so difficult. I mean, I can't even imagine where you'd even start with that to actually successfully pull that off. But I think there's definitely bits and pieces here and there. I think there's a lot of research that's been done in the last couple of decades in terms of flavor science and technology. And I think the fact that we now have plant-based meats and, eventually cellular agriculture, these are kind of ways in which flavor has sort of been highlighted as really critical and important, like being able to mimic
Mm-hmm.
the taste of meat has, put a lot of resources into these new technologies. But then the sort of next step is, can we do something where people somehow we can experience food the same way that a machine does? I don't, that's
Yeah.
like super sci-fi level. Like that's like really extreme. But I think if we can do that, I think the foods of the future would be completely changed.
Oh, for sure. I'm just as you were talking, I'm just thinking about like all the different things that go into food, and for someone to like something, someone might like I don't know, for some reason Kraft mac and cheese to some people
Yeah.
that is horrible for some people. Like they couldn't think of it. And to other people, yeah, they don't think it's very good, but they like it and they have fond memories of it. So it's
Yes.
like in a different way than a flavor like, but it
Yep.
does affect how they perceive it. And if we could, like, how do you even begin to quantify something like that in any form that's predictable? Is I don't even know.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I almost think it's the same sort of transformation that's happening in the pharmaceutical industry, where they're not quite there, but they're able to quantify some of the behaviors of molecules and their impact on, neurology and
Mm.
organ systems and so on and so forth. And it's like if you just get enough data, at some point you might be able to do something similar for food. But that's
That
so
is
far
true.
down the road.
I
Hmm.
know. And as well, like even with food, we say corn. Like if I say something like corn is going to taste regionally different between different
Yep.
places. So what is the true flavor of corn? Like what makes corn to one person and to another? Like just thinking about all these different things and seasonal differences. And
Yep.
it's
Yep.
it's um it's quite impressive how these major companies are even able to create such a like I know you said surveys and all that, like they must obviously have, I mean, you probably already know a little bit with the consultancy, but just, getting to a point to find something beloved like an Oreo, like so
Oh my
to
gosh.
figure it out
Yeah.
that so many people like this particular, it's
Uh-huh.
I don't know how they do it.
It's nuts. Yeah. I've read one article about the guy who he was developing like a new Dr. Pepper flavor. And he was actually a mathematician. He wasn't a
Oh.
food scientist, but he involved himself in food science. And he created this like crazy set of algorithms. And then the inputs were just like thousands and thousands of participants trying very minute iterations of the
Huh.
the Pepsi flavor or the Dr. Pepper flavor, just minutely changing the sugar and minutely changing the
Mhm.
acidity and but just there's just enough information. Then he found like these sort of points. There's always like a few of them. It's not just one, but where
Mhm.
people fall in love with that particular product. And it's funny because when he tried it, he's like, I hate it because it tastes disgusting. It's too much sugar.
Uh-huh. Well, that makes sense a little bit too. I mean, when you have resources, I guess in a way it's almost like infinite resources, it sounds like, but you could really
Yeah.
make something like, yeah, because I know sometimes I have a product that's a pretty big namesake and I'm like, people like this? Like, this is what you chose to have in the end. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly.
Preparing for this next set of like the food industry and such, like if you were to advise, upcoming students who are looking to be effective food scientists, like what skills do you think would be really good to hone in and just practice and have ready for them?
I really wish I learned programming. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
it's kind of a funny thing to say because for a long time I think I avoided anything involving computers because I love the lab. I love being in the doing syntheses. And nowadays I do a lot of flavor counting. So, I love that experience and having that hands-on. But the problem is like I'm talking about with sort of the big data aspect, you're going to really need to know how to handle statistics, and you need to know how to handle large data sets, just because a lot of the insights come from that. Because as a single person, I can't I can barely make like 5 flavors for like one client, and it takes me weeks, right?
Hmm.
And if I could cut that time down significantly just by inputting things into a computer, that would save me a lot of trouble. And I already do that. I create my own spreadsheets using the sweetness of sugars, and sort of, kind of connecting some of these quantitative values with some of these mountains. So high intensity sweeteners or alternative sugars and that sort of thing. And that helps a lot. That really does cut down a lot of the mental load, because
Hmm.
otherwise I'd have to sit here and create a 10 by 10 array of various sweeteners. And that's just not, it's not practical. And unfortunately the food industry doesn't have that kind of resources unless you're a large
Hmm.
CPG company. A lot of these startups and these small companies and businesses run by 2 or 3 people, they don't they need answers quickly, and probably the easiest way to do that is to create a simulation or a program. So
That's totally agree. Even now I realize how important it is for programming and I want to learn, but it sometimes feels, even though you know it would benefit you, it's very intimidating. Like you're
oh
like,
my
oh well,
gosh, yes.
you're like, oh, people go to school for this, or it's like the way it's presented, you go to
Hmm.
pop it open and you're like, oh, maybe I'll do it tomorrow. Yeah, I'll start it tomorrow. And it's
Yeah.
very overwhelming. And then you're like, well, which program do I use? And I'm
Yep.
I'm a little shocked. Like maybe things will change, but I really wish I learned programming in like I used MATLAB in my first year. I recall
Hmm.
nothing of it, and I don't. It was poorly taught, and maybe
Right.
like I'm not trying to fault the professor, but it it didn't get excitement for me. Like I didn't understand how this would actually benefit me. Now I'm like,
Right.
I
Right.
really wish I could have grasped it better, because I know that there's a lot of potential that I can unlock, but it's sitting down and learning. It's intimidating.
It's for sure. And it's funny that you say that, because I look back and I think about, I when you're learning something, there is a joy to it, like, at least you
Hmm.
hope, right? Like, but then, like, for better or worse, I think, when you're kind of facing the real world, some of the things that you need to learn, just you almost have to brute force it. Like finances. Like, it's one of those things that, like,
Yeah.
I would have hated to learn it as a kid. Like, I would have no joy. But,
Hmm.
like, I feel like now as an adult, I'm like, shoot, like, it would have been really nice to, like, know how to do taxes just, like, off
Yeah.
off the cuff, right? And I think programming is a little bit like that for those who aren't,
Mhm.
naturally inclined towards that.
For sure. And it's just like your exposure to it. Like maybe if you had a fun computer lab, but like I learned the closest I got to web design was because of Neopets. And even today,
Yeah, Neopets.
I feel like that was my first foray into being like, okay, I could do some web design, because that was very, very useful to me at that time. Got to
Right,
make that
right.
like profile perfect, but
Exactly. That's totally, yeah, I feel that.
so I wish I had that like something that could get me excited about it. And maybe it's also because
Hmm.
computers have changed so much since I mean, Neopets and doing HTML was a big, I mean, that was pretty advanced for the time. I mean, I guess.
Right?
Like I
Yeah.
feel like, but now that I'm thinking about it, like so much has gone in the past year, and I feel like you turn around and you're like, oh, the programming's changed. And it's just like now it feels so far out with the capabilities that I don't know. Maybe it'll change. Maybe I know the accessibility of it is going down. The more
Yeah.
and more we move on. So maybe that'll be the push. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. My dream is that I can just talk to my computer and it'll just build it for me.
Maybe that would be awesome. I know sometimes I think that too. And I'm like, maybe in 5 years I'll just be able to, if I just wait it out,
Just
it'll
wait
be
it
there.
out. Yeah. Just wait it out. Let someone else design it.
Even though that's not good. No, I should really, it is very, when I started to be able to do statistics before, it seemed like a black box. I'm like, oh, it's not. that, I
Right.
mean, the degree of statistics, I digress, but um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's exciting stuff coming up in the food industry, and it's really cool that you get the opportunity as a consultant to just see things moving forward, like seeing where new ideas are coming from different people. It's really cool.
Yeah. It's fascinating. And at the same time, like I think food industry is kind of those weird industries where like, you know, there's advances and then they don't really get implemented. Like I think like, you know,
Yeah, I know.
there's big talk in like, you know, tech industry, finance industry, biotech, farm.
Hmm.
And then you talk about food and it's like, yeah, we're still, you know, retorting beverages and you know
Yeah,
like
yeah,
we're still like that's the best way to do it because the margins aren't good and
yeah.
you know, and flavors are still gonna like the best synthetic ones are the ones that went out. And it's just like there's a lot of anachronisms that I'm so
Mhm.
surprised by. But it's fun. It has its own sort of Wild West.
For sure, for sure. And I know that we kind of talked about this, but I always do like to ask my guests who come on the show, what advice would you give to students looking to go into, I might have already asked this. Whoops. Sorry. I was going to round me
Okay.
out, but I know you kind of already answered the question because I'm trying to end our conversation nicely. I don't know where to go with this. Ah.
Oh, yeah, I don't
Um,
know if you don't know if you wanted to open up the box of how I got here.
you know what? Yeah, you know what? We're gonna end the episode by doing, you don't like being typical, so we're gonna end the episode in a very strange spot. We're gonna ask, like, how did you end up choosing food science after a chemistry degree? Like, I could understand if you were doing a food science degree and went to food science PhD, but like, I feel like that's a hard transition. So, like, why did you end up deciding to do that?
Yeah, so, you know, the reasons I chose chemistry as my initial degree were mostly because I spent a lot of time in high school being antisocial. And so I built a lab in my garage and I was playing a lot with fireworks. And so like and I would do like magic tricks for people with chemistry. And so for me it was a lot about connecting with people. Like I love visuals. I love the idea like you can take compounds and make something surprising for someone. But then after I graduated, I realized, you know, there weren't a whole lot of pathways to where I felt like I could connect chemistry with people. There was education and that was always in the back of my mind, but it never really called to me. And so I took a year off and I actually walked across the country of the United States from
Wow.
California to Louisiana. So I spent 6 months doing that. It was about 2,000 miles. And I spent
Wow.
and it because you have to eat a lot and you meet a lot of people along the way who invite you to for dinner in the house. I just like food just became this massive passion for me because it was one of those things that I finally realized, you know, the caloric intake, the nutrients, the, you know, the design of it. And every time I go to a grocery store on that walk, I was like, I can't find anything to eat because, you know, there's like 1,001 products, but I couldn't
Hmm.
find anything to eat because I needed very specific, you know, nutrient intake, high calorie, high density. You know, I was burning like 3,500 to 4,000 calories. And by the end of it, I was like a twig. But yeah, so food just became this focal point. But then I didn't really think too much about it. And then I met my wife, or my who would end up becoming my wife, and like she loves food. Like she's a huge foodie. Like I'm kind of a foodie, but she lives
That's
and
so
breathes food.
nice.
Yeah, so her passion really rubbed off on me. And then I was kind of in between things. I ended up getting a master's in chemistry just to sort of keep going and kind of make my decision afterwards. But I did find a paper about flavor and flavor chemistry. And it finally clicked in my head because I was like, these are organic compounds. They interact with people. and people love food. Like, so it
Okay.
was yeah, it took a while, and it was a lot of turns, but I managed to finally arrive at food science, and I was like, oh my gosh, there are departments of food science. I cannot believe this. I didn't know that. I didn't know that as you know in undergraduate or anything.
Hmm.
So once I realized I could do it, I went ahead and applied, and that was really probably the best decision I made, because it really married all my interests together, and it put me in a position to, maybe I could have hacked it with just a chemistry degree. I was slated to do a PhD in chemistry at some point, and I'm sure I'd find my way to it, but I think at least with this pathway, it makes more sense, and I'm allowed to. I'm sort of in this position where I can do this consulting, versus I don't know if I'd have probably would have needed like 5 or 10 years of experience in the industry,
Hmm.
in the food industry to sort of hack that.
Well, I'm going to leave it there because I think that your path and where you are now has shown there's so many wonderful ways that you can go into food. There's so many different ways you can market yourself. You can show off your skills. You can, just like with the messaging of today, like being clear with what you want to do, it can really take you far. So I'm going to leave it at there, Bryan. But before I do go, if people want to find you, where can we find you?
Yeah, I've got my website at www.bryanquocle, that's BryanQuocle.com. And yeah, but if you can type my name, Bryan Lay, food scientist, you'll find me.
Amazing. Well, I'll make sure to link you in the show notes, so make it a little easier for everyone. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. This was a great conversation, lots of fun, and I think what you're doing is, I don't know, we talk about it, but your marketing's clearly doing something because like I'm seeing you everywhere. So keep doing that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that, Veronica.
That was episode 66 of the FoodGrads Podcast. All the notes to this podcast can be found by clicking on the Student and Grads tab on the FoodGrads website. There you can find notes to past or future episodes on our newly designed podcast page. This episode of the podcast is powered by Careers Now. Careers Now is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry for exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. If you enjoyed this episode, then please head over to wherever you listen to this podcast and rate it 5 stars. This helps us to get the word out about the podcast and share how great this industry is. Thank you everyone so much for listening. I know that you could be listening to anything else right now, but you chose us. So thank you. Okay, so I wasn't joking when I said I swear I have seen Bryan everywhere online prior to this episode. Reddit, Twitter, he's actually done multiple Ask Me Anythings, which is pretty cool. So if you actually want to go more in depth about what he has done, go check it out. Bryan has also done a ton of other podcasts, interviews. So if you want to hear more about him and how he's navigating food science, being a consultant, all that really cool stuff, then go check those out too. If you follow him on LinkedIn, very accessible. Though I can see why this is the case after this episode, Bryan is just such a warm and welcoming individual that he's just so easy to talk to. He's willing to share his knowledge, and I hope all goes well with his consultancy. The thing that surprised me the most was when he mentioned that as a consultant, he doesn't try to act like he's a specialist at all food science. Instead, he uses the skills. So the key is the skills he picked up from his PhD and what he continues to learn from his consultancy to be an effective aid for projects. After he explained that to me, it just made so much more sense, because coming in this episode, I was just like, how do you say that you are an expert in food science when I think everyone who's listening has started to figure out that food science is just as general as food is? I mean, after all, you can't be an expert in every food topic. It's just too much. It's like a trained chef that you have all these skills to be able to cook. So you can cut, you can sear, you can do all that stuff. And you have those skills, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you specialize in every cuisine. You can maybe basically do them, but to be a specialist, you really have to hone in on that craft. And it seems that Brian kind of acting like a chef in a way, doing this consultancy. But you know what? That's okay. Clearly, it's working out well for him, and that's really cool. It's, I think, really good applicable advice to, and I think we've heard this in the podcast before, to really remember what you're doing in school. And even as a student, like you are picking up skills, those part-time jobs. We talk about soft skills, we talk about transferable skills. Well, we talk about them because they exist. So I know school's really fast. I know that the world moves fast, but if you can just stop to maybe slow down and remember and focus and really show good examples of these skills, and even just build confidence in yourself to say, like, I did this then. It's kind of similar to what I do now. That's also a really great step because I think we can forget that. Well, that's it for this week's episode. Thank you everyone so much for listening, and I will see you next time.